Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's last segment on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to us always by the GSMC Sports Network. And the guy who we're about to talk about just got a big money contract, 4 years, one of the highest paid defensive tackles in the league, deservedly so, and he really is the spark on this defense, and that, of course, is Chris Jones. When all is said and done, and we look back at the Chiefs' defenses of the Pat Mahomes era, you're not necessarily going to remember that many players because you're going to remember Patrick Mahomes on the offense. But if there's one player who's always going to be a constant from this era for the Chiefs, it has to be Chris Jones. And when they sat down at the negotiating table, they knew they could not lose him because of his importance to the squad. And what the Chiefs are building here is something that centers around versatility. And when I look at Chris Jones, I see the most versatile defensive tackle in the league because he can play anywhere on the line. He'll still be damaged. He's a big physical presence that you always have to account for, no matter what. And he's just going to take up a lot of space and really muddles what your offense can do. So that's why it was so integral to the offseason plans of the Chiefs to maintain Chris Jones and retain him for years to come because he is such a pivotal part of what makes this underrated defense tick. And so let's jump right into his stats throughout his career. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 795.1 fantasy points. His best season was 2018, where he had 152. 20 solo tackles last year, 13 tackles for loss, 11 sacks, and 4 passes defended for him. And so, when I look at Chris Jones, I see a player who, on a defensive line that has a mixture of versatility, physicality, and grit. I see someone who is really sustaining the fact that the Chiefs' defense is going to hit you at all levels. No matter who's playing where, the Chiefs are always going to be someone who are going to consistently get pressure. As a testament to C-Spagnuolo as well, he always comes up with special schemes for his players to integrate. But Chris Jones certainly really helps him scheme what he wants to do. Because when you look at this defensive line for the Chiefs, I see guys like Mike Dana and Derek Gennady who I really like as depth pieces, but are not necessarily people you recognize as being on a high-level defensive line. But then I look at Chris Jones and George Karlaftis, and I think this is the perfect pairing. Because Chris Jones can come off, say, the right end, George Karlaftis the left. Maybe they can interchange that a little bit. But when all is said and done, Chris Jones is more of an interior lineman. And in a 4-3 scheme where you can rely more upon stunts and sims and pressures, Chris Jones can play anywhere along that line and be comfortable with knowing he has a guy on the edge who is athletic and gets to the quarterback in his own way, and he has players in the middle who he can rely upon to just offer that sense of physicality, to jam blockers, and really get him going as well. Because when all is said and done, Chris Jones is not just someone who eats up blockers. He's someone who can get to the quarterback as well. And so, what I really love about the upside of a player like Chris Jones is no matter what, he's going to get production. Because Steve Spagnuolo realizes that in order for him to get more ambitious with his schemes and his defensive fits, Chris Jones is going to be someone who can get most of that production. I actually really think he's going to help Karlaftis, who I'm going to talk about a little bit more later in the week when I do his IDP player profile. Because you look at that tandem, Chris Jones is definitely the more prototypical nose tackle kind of guy. he's the bigger presence who's going to take up a lot more space. George Karloff is definitely a big guy. He's around 270, 280, but he fits more of the mold of the athletic guy who can place on the outside, who can create space for himself, which honestly takes a lot of pressure off Mike Dana and Derek Gennady because they don't necessarily have to do too much. Because if George Karlaftis is creating for himself, coming up with different ways to rush the quarterback, and Chris Jones is eating up the blockers, that actually takes a lot of pressure off Mike Dana and Derek Gennady. It also opens up the space for them as well. Because when you have two dominant players on your defensive front, and you're more of the role players who kind of fit in as you see fit, then that really adds up to this culture of every man for themselves, what I think Steve Spagnuolo really likes. And it might be a caveat to say it that way, but I see a lot of individual talent on this Chiefs roster. I see a lot of players who fill in fits for other players as well. In certain deficiencies, some players are better at other players, and in certain areas, some players are worse. For better or worse, when I look at the Chiefs squad, that's the best of what I can say about Chris Jones because he fills a lot of those deficiencies. Mike Dan and Derek Gennady might not be the guys who can create after jamming blockers, so Chris Jones kind of fills that void. They might not be known for their pass rush moves. George Karlaftis fills that role. And so I think that when the Chiefs knew Chris Jones was wanting a huge money contract, they were willing to offer it to him right away because they knew he was going to be the biggest role. They knew it was going to require the most attention. And when all is said and done, Chris Jones represents a defense that is greater than the sum of its parts. You have high-profile players. You have guys like L'Jarius Sneed on the back end. You have Karlaftis, like I said. But you have more of these role player guys who are just trying to fit in. And with Chris Jones, it just makes it a whole ton easier because you can do so many things with him. His size alone is something that is very rare in a player of his caliber. His versatility alone is something rare for a player of his caliber. When you combine that with a defense that makes do with what they have, that's good enough for Steve Spagnuolo and the Kansas City Chiefs. But that should just about do it for today's show. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you yet again for tuning into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you at the GSMC Sports Network. I have been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning into this great show. We'll be back tomorrow with yet another edition of the show. Back better than ever. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in.